In this video, we're going to create an authentication filter, and it will be used when an HTTP request is sent for user to sign in into our application. So I will go to a security package and I will create a new class and I will call it Authentication Filter and click on Finish. Okay, we have our filter. And this class is kind of large and there's a lot of typing, so I will copy and paste little code snippets one by one, and I will be walking you through what they do. First of all, this authentication filter will need to extend one class, and it is username and password authentication filter, which comes from Spring Framework. So let me import it right away. And I will need to import Authentication Manager. All these classes come from Spring Framework. We don't have to create them. These classes are part of the framework. All we need to do is to use them properly so that user authentication works. And now, because we have extended username password authentication filter, there are a couple of methods that we'll need to override. And the first one is called attempt authentication. And let me import the return type. This is going to be authentication from org Spring Framework security. And let me import servlet request, servlet response, authentication exception, user login request model is our class. We have created it, and this is the class into which a JSON payload containing username and password gets converted when a request for login is sent. Let's import that. Let's import object mapper, and let's import username password authentication token, array list, and input output as exception. Okay, so what's going to happen when our web service receives a request to authenticate user? Spring Framework will be used to authenticate our user with the username and password that were provided by the user, and this method will be triggered. And the JSON payload that was included in the request body will be used to create user login request model Java class, which we have created. It contains email and password, and email is being used as a username in our case. Next, we will use Authentication Manager, which comes from Spring. We have declared it here and it's been initialized in our constructor. So Authentication Manager will be used to authenticate user, and it will use email and password, which are being read from the user login and request model. Now the Spring Framework will do all the work that it needs. It will look up user in our database, and for that we have implemented a method load user by username. It will find the user, it will authenticate the user using username and password, and if username and password match the record that we have, a new method will be triggered, and I'm going to paste it here. It's called successful authentication. So once our request containing user and password is successfully authenticated, the successful authentication was called. If username or password are not correct, then this method, successful authentication, will not be called. So let me import filter chain, servlet exception, user, and user should come from Spring Framework security core user details. And then here we go. This is our JSON web token. I will import it from IO JSON web token. We have used the dependency in our POM.xml. In just a second, I'll show you this. So we have imported JSON web token, and let's import the signature algorithm. So once the authentication is successful, this method will be called by the Spring Framework. We have date that we need to import. I will import Java util date. Okay, and the username will be read from the authentication object, and then we will use JSON web token, a library that we have included in our POM.xml. I'll open a POM.xml source file and I'll scroll down a little bit, and this is the dependency that we have added. And actually there is a newer version, 9, and you can search for this project. You can copy the group ID and then open browser window and then simply search for it, Google for it, and open the GitHub page. And on this page you can have the source code and a little more about what the JSON Web Token is and how it's being used. And this is how it will look once it is generated, and it will be included into a header information of our request. So I will not go into details what are these parts of each JSON Web Token. At this moment, all we need to know is that this JSON Web Token will then be used in authorization filter. Once it is generated, it will be included into the header, and the client that receives this response will need to extract this web token, and it will need to store it. And if it is, for example, iOS mobile application, then this JSON Web Token will most likely be stored in iOS keychain. And then every time the mobile application will need to communicate with protected resources, like, for example, get list of all users or update user details or delete user details. When it needs to communicate with our API, it will need to include this JSON Web Token as a header into the request. Otherwise, the request will not be authorized. So we are using JSON Web Toolkit library, and we are building this JSON Web Token. Web Token will contain the username, and then it will contain the expiration. We're building the expiration time, and we are using the security constants which we have created in the previous video. So we're getting the current milliseconds, and then we're adding 10 days to it. The security constants contains the milliseconds that will be equal to 10 days. And then we're signing this web token with using the signature algorithm, and this is going to be SHA SHA-512. And for signature, we're using, again, token secret, which is being read from the security constants. And this token secret, I have created it. It's an alphanumeric string of characters. You can change this string into, you can add other characters. Generally, it is generated and stored in a property file. And later on, I'll show you how to read this token secret from a property file. So it must be a unique string of characters that will be used to sign the JSON Web Token. And this is it. Once the JSON Web Token is generated, it will be added as a header information. So our header will contain the token that we have just generated. And I will show you how to view this token details in the response when I execute HTTP request to log user in or to authorize user using the Postman HTTP client. And this is it. You can pause this video, you can type this from the screen, or you can take the source code from the project I'm attaching to this video course. And actually this line of code, you don't need it, I commented out. A little bit later in this video course, we will come back to authentication filter and we will add this line which will read the token secret from the property file. So I'll delete it for now and save my work. And last step is for us to take this authentication filter and add it to web security. So here, when we configure the web security, we have configured that the sign up URL is the public URL and that all other URLs need to be authenticated. And we will continue here, and I will add, and we will add filter, which is for authenticating our user. So that's going to be new authentication filter that we have just created. And I will need to give it an argument, authentication manager. And now this filter will participate in web security, and when a request is sent to authenticate user, it will be used by Spring Framework, and we don't really have to do anything extra. So let's save our work and let's run this application and see how it works.